Hello, everyone, and good morning. My name is Ryan Lackey. I work for Cloudflare, a CDN DDoS mitigation company, and I'm speaking at Black Hat Europe 2014. So just a quick disclaimer, my employer does offer customer two-factor authentication for our website. We use it internally because of PCI and a bunch of other reasons. We're not a two-factor authentication vendor. I've personally helped through consulting and helping out friends, people adopt two-factor authentication, and I think it has serious issues, but it's also a very useful tool. Just a quick background about me. I've worked in startups and in security for about 20 years now. I ran an offshore data haven in the North Sea called Havenco back in 2000, anonymous electronic cash stuff before, defense contracting, satellite stuff in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now I had a trusted computing startup for a while that got bought by Cloudflare earlier this year. So in the next 25 minutes, we're going to cover quite a bit of material. A quick overview of what two-factor authentication is. I mean, it should be obvious to everyone here. Strengths and weaknesses, what changed over time. There were some assumptions made when two-factor authentication was first introduced that aren't really true anymore, and things that have been adopted over the years that aren't really so true. How the threats have evolved over time, and then two major weaknesses in two-factor authentication, and then advice, best practice, and future goals to best implement this. So what is two-factor authentication, or more properly, multi-factor authentication? It's choosing two or more independent factors for authentication, chosen from at least two of the sets of knowledge factors like passwords, knowledge-based authentication questions, things like that, possession, a physical token, or effectively a data file is protected by some sort of control mechanism, or inherent, something that the user is, a biometric or some other credential that's inherent to the user. This stuff has a pretty long history. I mean, there's stuff before this, but credit cards that have a signature verification on the same time as a magstripe, magstripe cards that have a PIN, such as an ATM card, and then password plus physical identity checks. So if you're at a checkpoint and they check your ID plus they ask for the word of the day, that would also be a two-factor form of authentication. So it has a long history, but it has a long history of failures. Signature checking for things like credit cards has always been kind of a joke. You can write a line. It's used for after-the-fact forensic analysis and for some legal things, but it doesn't really protect you from time-of-use attacks in almost all cases. ATM pins the same way. It's a little bit stronger, but we have people who put their pins on the cards. We have skimmers all across devices, skimmers being this crazy, huge industry now. And then documents, like you can just show up with pretty much anybody's photo. If you match some basic parameters, there's probably maybe 30 or 40 data points, or 30 or 40 bits of, or rather, no, more like 6 to 10 bits of information that you can pass most photos. And then there's things like a totally fake authentication credential. These are camouflage passports that people use that are for countries that don't actually exist. So you're not carrying like a fraudulent document because it's for a country that never existed. I'm familiar with at least one of those, Sealand, from back in the day. But so this is another thing. But these are the physical world versions of these things. We've had two-factor authentication in computer systems for a long time. There's SKey, OP, the old secure ID tokens, the offline devices. These probably, I've seen them since the early 2000s. There were some in the late 90s. You also have things like SSH keys and other things. So you've had two-factor authentication, at least in the enterprise environment or in the sysadmin environment for quite a long time. They had traits that were really useful. They were generally disconnected. They were offline. They were physically distinct from the protected system. They weren't run on the same system. And they had some negatives. They were difficult to implement. You ended up with a bunch of problems. The biggest problem I personally had was stuff like this, where you ended up with like a different two-factor auth token for every one of your accounts. They could be bank accounts, they could be sysadmin accounts, they could be multiple role accounts at work, they could be all sorts of crazy stuff. And you ended up with like a bag full of tokens or a keyring full of tokens, which was pretty crazy. Another exciting thing happened a little while ago. With regard to one of these tokens, I forward you this file for you to review. Please open and view it. The RSA secure ID breach, obviously, where the seed that was used in a lot of the tokens was extracted and various targets were compromised as an attack, or as a result of the attack. So yeah, there's that. So this sort of motivated this whole shift towards soft tokens. They have a lot of advantages. Cheaper, easier to provision. And basically, in any sort of security control, the easiest possible way to implement it is ultimately going to win. And these were a lot easier to implement, a lot easier to manage, a lot easier to reissue than the physical tokens were. And it solved this problem of like having 10 different tokens because you just have different entries in your Google Authenticator or your other authentication app, which was pretty cool. And about the same time, PCI was pushing people toward implementing two-factor for a lot of applications. There's some issues with how it's been done, but we'll just go over it really quickly. PCI 2.0 made a first stab at this, and it's not really very specific about what you want, and it's not really terribly thorough. So with this, you potentially could have one or two users use it for certain remote access. So there's that. 3.0 fixed this to some extent. It requires effectively a random sample of users be verified, and as a result, you end up with all users have to be verified, and it's used for more applications. Is this. But there's still a problem. It's all really designed around remote access still, not critical systems. So if you've got critical systems at work, even if they're in scope, they don't necessarily need, if they're accessed locally, don't need to have two-factor authentication. And of course, your QSA could differ on this. But and there's not really very specific guidance on two-factor. I mean, PCI in general is fairly in the middle about how detailed it is, but I think this is an area where it could do with being a little bit more specific about the controls that are acceptable, the types of two-factor and the types of applications that need to be protected. And specific guidance about one of the vulnerabilities I'm showing should be included. So then also in this two-factor auth soft token land, there was a push toward using SMS and call-based authentication, because not everyone had smartphones, or not everyone, not all, especially for consumer applications, not everyone had a smartphone, and the other applications were generally smartphone-based. So either in addition to or in place of time or hash-based one-time or one-time password authentication on the smartphone, the providers provided this SMS or call-based authentication. And there's a problem here. It's not really a great photo, but Google Voice allows you to forward your SMS to voicemail. So a lot of configurations, people have this this kind of thing configured where either their SMS is forward, their SMS is shared, their voicemail is shared, otherwise vulnerable. So you've got call forwarding as a vulnerability, a bunch of normal configuration type things, which are one thing to worry about. But then there's the problem of malware. Malware evolved very, very quickly once SMS and email and calls were the primary means of passing out, especially banking credentials, which are used by large numbers of users, especially in Europe and Asia. So there's been like pretty much a limitless number. This is just a short summary of some of the attacks, the malware that are designed just to steal SMSs and call authentication information. And some more. So something sort of close to me was the CEO of my company actually fell prey to this particular attack before I joined the company. Google Apps had a password recovery mechanism. Like there are 4 different security flaws that all chained together led to his personal Gmail being compromised, which led to a Twitter account being compromised, which led to lulls and then prison for some people. So yeah. Another great two-factor technique or technology that people are using are smart cards. Exciting news from FIDO Alliance particularly is coming recently, but smart cards, especially like I think cell phones, and then for me in the enterprise, the DoD CAC card, the Common Access Credential, were really the best access control type models of this. The CAC with the smart card readers was deployed pretty much across the DoD and throughout other parts of the security part of the US government, and there was a reader for BlackBerry that would pair with Bluetooth. There was a bunch of smart card readers on your laptop, on your keyboard, everything else. Generally would interface with Microsoft Authentication Active Directory to log into your systems, and was reasonably secure. Unfortunately, it doesn't really help you if there's this whole system doesn't protect you if there's malware running on the host that's being protected, because the authentication happens right there, and the smart card doesn't have any direct user I/O. So as a result, malware arose that was targeting these specific things. More so for banking, but the banking ones are more widely discussed because they're consumer facing and they have large numbers of users, and there's regulatory issues. The enterprise targeted attacks on smart card-based authentication are generally not as widely discussed because they try to keep it within the enterprise. Another whole category are, of course, biometrics. Anything from fingerprint to iris to retina to hand geometry to various other things. They've, of course, got some issues. The readers themselves usually are expensive, although this is falling dramatically. It doesn't really help you when something's running on the connected host again. and you can't reissue. The nice thing about all the other kinds of credentials is that if something does happen and you revoke, you can reissue the credential, but changing your eyeball outside of like Total Recall and things like that is not really a viable strategy and has a lot of user pushback. So there's a problem there. Something that was very interesting was the Touch ID for the iPhone 5. Both CCC and one of my colleagues, Mark Rogers, were able to compromise it, I think, within like a day of it being out, and using very simple stuff, using some PC board and Elmer's glue, and there's that. So yeah, so biometrics are great in a lot of ways, but they have to be deployed in an overall secure system. And for consumer website authentication, they're really not a viable solution. Touch ID may change this, and it may change over time. We have Apple Pay launching soon, which will be an interesting application of this in the consumer space, but I think that's pretty much watch this space. And then there's another interesting form of two-factor. You've got the smartphone clients, things like Google Authenticator, various things like that. But now you have software-based two-factor authentication. I'm familiar with Authy, and there's several others of these. They're either implemented as local software that runs on the host, or they are implemented as also as local software running on the host, but like a browser extension, in this case a Chrome extension. And they effectively implement a TOTP or HOTP client, but it's running on the same user, usually same machine, everything else as the protected application. And as we see, all these things together have one common problem, one of the two common problems, which is they're not independent factors. If you compromise the host, you compromise the two-factor authentication device. All the malware that sits there, no matter how strong the two-factor auth mechanism is, if you can impersonate the user, it wins. And you end up with really two root causes of this. You have data and authentication that are running on the same device. So you have something like the TOTP app running in the same browser that's running all your other code. So if the browser's subverted, you lose. Or it's something unintentional where you have something like your multiple devices that are paired in different levels, at different places where the user wasn't really expecting them to be paired. One of the most appealing or interesting for me, unfortunately, responsible disclosure, everything else, is paired mobile devices. So when you have something like an iPhone paired to your Mac, or if you've got an Android device and you copy backups, you end up basically trusting both devices at the same level, and trust sort of doesn't go uphill, it goes downhill. So you can lose pretty excitingly. So you end up with full device backups, and you can just load them on a new device and extract the keys. And especially with the iPhone, we found in iOS, I haven't tried this yet on iOS 8, but iOS 7 and before, large amounts of the data and backups was not encrypted. This was Jonathan Zdarsky's work. So you can extract a lot of really interesting data from the backups. Often they're not encrypted if they're on the local disk as well. It's an additional option. Or they're encrypted with a password that's stored in the user's keyring. So there's that. And some of the backups do use non-exportable storage, but not all of them do. And there's also applications that allow you to do cloud recovery, which I think sort of breaks the assumption of two-factor auth that it's a separate device. So there's a bunch of existing attacks on this so far. I don't really know the best way to summarize them because they're actually fairly diverse, but they're all basically man-in-the-middle attacking the device. They're either malware. There's a lot of cases of desktop malware that has evolved over time to add a small SMS catcher component that runs on mobile, or it's desktop malware that's been ported to mobile, specifically with the goal of stealing credentials. But the real problem with that is that it used to be you'd have a computer, you'd take your computer with you on a multi-city trip or whatever, and you'd do work on the computer, but you'd have your phone and you'd use that for your secondary authentication device. But I know a lot of people now who travel with just a phone or with a phone and an iPad, or just with an iPad or whatever else, and there's really no difference. There's no second device they can use. So this assumption that you'd have two fully independent devices that aren't paired in any way is not really a great assumption anymore. So there's that. We'll put that aside for a second. There's another exciting area of compromise that people have been exploiting since at least 2012 publicly, and pretty much before that, like it's been an ongoing thing, is that basically this stuff is grafted onto existing code, onto existing systems. It's in many cases, PCI, people say you need to have two-factor auth to sell to enterprise clients because of PCI. And so somebody has an existing AAA system and they decide, oh, we quickly need to implement two-factor. How can we do the minimum amount of work to implement two-factor. So they bolted on to the front door, leaving all of these other unprotected areas of the application that don't actually use two-factor. There's a lot of reasons why they do that. One of it is quick time to market. One of it is they don't really think through the consequences of it. The other thing is there's a lot of cases where there's a very restricted user interface available to the other applications, either because it's somebody else's code that they're interfacing with. It's something like Google multi-factor that needs to work with existing mail clients that only have a field for password, or some other system like that where there's no ability to add an extra additional step and they have to graft it onto the existing step. Or things where the form factor of the device or the interaction is very painful to the user implementing additional codes. It could be a device that doesn't have a good keyboard or mouse or a keyboard or display or anything on it. And also, it's really the things that people don't look at so much that get compromised. It's the infrequent things like account recovery, special users, internal users. A lot of internal systems end up not getting two-factor while the external systems do, and things like that. So those are really interesting places to look. And a lot of people have been looking at those areas. So everyone from, Duo has been incredibly active in this field. They're looking at PayPal, looking at Google. I think they're probably the leaders in finding two-factor bypasses through this particular technique. But there was a teenager who found a vulnerability in PayPal as well. So it's not really only a few people that are doing it. And these are only people disclosing these publicly and responsibly. There's plenty of people who have this is a very cookie cutter type attack, so you can just go after any API for a lot of services and look at the features that are either infrequent, like things that meet the characteristics I described, the things that are either infrequently used, internal use, restricted, and where they can add in the passwords, things like that. One of the most interesting things people have seen is Google's application-specific passwords are sort of training people to think that they're like these passwords are in some way restricted, but they're full passwords and they give full access to the account. So there's sort of a mismatch between user belief about what the system does and what the system actually implements. And yeah, the Duo guys found the exciting PayPal vulnerability using this. This was the hook that they looked into. So they looked and they saw that there was this little error that said that certain pieces of the application weren't supporting two-factors, so it was a good place to look. So if you look back a little bit, there's a lot of places that are really interesting to poke around. Unfortunately, there's some people who believe more in responsible disclosure than I do that have encouraged me not to do certain things, so yeah. So what is the consequence of all this stuff? We want to reevaluate whether your two factors are actually independent of each other. It doesn't do you too much good to put your authentication application in the same place as your protected data. And then there's the whole malware threat. Basically, any system that could be vulnerable to malware, if it's attractive enough, is going to be. One of the most interesting things about this is that it's usually banking applications, which usually do vary by country. So, for instance, I know the US banking applications for the banks I use relatively well, because there's like 2 of them. But I'm not familiar with like the Indonesian banking system or with other various systems out there. And I think it's very unlikely that counter malware systems are going to stay up on all of these secondary and tertiary market banking applications in as real time as people come up with new threats. So that's a constant area to attack. And people need to redesign their systems so multi-factor authentication is inherent to the system. So make sure that every single form of authentication goes through the same authentication pathway, and don't leave these like gaping backdoors that don't have their authentication system. There's a lot of things that do work incredibly well, though. Application-specific two-factor auth, Facebook and Twitter have done a great job of implementing both, where the application itself passes credentials back and forth. Devices that take multiple inputs. This is a really, really interesting idea, is that your device actually, or your protected application, is constantly evaluating the security parameters of the environment which it's operating. If it sees something abnormal, it will require heightened authentication versus in normal operation mode. And a great example of this is on mobile, where you have a very restricted user interface, and users want to be able to implement or be able to input a very small passcode each time they use a device. Maybe if the device has been unused for a long period of time, you want a more secure passphrase than if it's a shorter term one, or if the device has been put in a Faraday bag, or some various things like that. There's various indicators that will show if the device needs to have a heightened state of alert. Amazon is a great example of this. They allow some very low risk interactions to operate with very little authentication using like old cookies and various other things. But if you want to review your account history or change payment mechanisms or something like that, they require a heightened level of authentication. Physical authentication devices that do have direct UI, things that have keypads, things that have displays for transaction details. I've seen these especially in the Bitcoin space. So Bitcoin is really exciting for a lot of reasons. Even if you don't believe in it as a payment system or anything else, it's really the cutting edge of malware attacking it right now. Because if you have like final settlement of any sort of attack and you have good anonymity. So the problem with attacking traditional banking systems is you still might go to jail after the fact and get caught. With Bitcoin, you have pretty good chances of doing a theft without being caught, or without being caught after the fact. A lot of these devices are now showing, there's like the Trezor device that shows some of the transaction details on it, things that have direct user input, direct user output that will show transaction details that are specific to the transaction. So even if malware compromises your machine fully, you can verify that the transaction that's happening is the correct transaction off of the device in a secure domain. And then you have out-of-band notifications. One of the really obvious in retrospect, but not really obvious to people when they're building systems, is that a lot of transactions are themselves reversible, especially banking transactions. So an attacker usually compromises the system at a certain point in time, does not retain control of the system forever. Or at least the user has some chance if they can do something later. So what you do is you send delayed notifications, you send delayed authentication requests, things like that, out of band, and let the user roll back a transaction. But one of the most exciting things out there is actually client OS protected storage. As I said earlier, the people moving toward mobile platforms is a serious risk for this because it eliminates this potential to use them as a second form of authentication. However, the advantage is they actually have a relatively good security model compared to most desktop operating systems, particularly on the hardware protection front. I worked in trusted computing for a long time, and that's a great goal to have is trusted computing on the desktop, but I think we're still a ways away. There's some great work going on there, but it's compared to the iPhone, where there's trusted computing pretty much by default on every iPhone, there's a long ways to go. So X509 client certs are a really interesting technology that have been around now for like 20 years and haven't, a little bit less than 20 years, but haven't really caught on for two reasons. Browser UI issues on desktop and the lack of protected storage because it's just a local file in your system. So on mobile, that's no longer really true. You have local protected storage for things like client certs, and you have browser UI that's actually pretty good for how it handles these for storing these things. So I would say that in the case where you're not going to have an out-of-band device doing your authentication with showing you transaction details, showing you PIN input and everything else, you can get essentially all the advantage of traditional two-factor auth using TOTP, HOTP, client and everything else just by using client certs. So there's some usability advantage there. So you either sacrifice some usability and you get the same, you get better security, or you could have roughly the same security and get a lot better usability. So those are some interesting things. But yeah, unfortunately, there's a couple of areas where one could poke at certain APIs and get some really interesting stuff out of them that I am in the middle of an RD process on. So yeah, I'd be happy to do questions. If anyone has questions at this point, I'd be. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks.